So I'm here to talk to you about the census. And one of the things I have learned never, ever to assume is that people actually know why we do a census in this country. We do a really bad job of teaching our own history. We do, seriously. So the census is required by the United States Constitution. It is the way by which we allocate political power at the federal level in this country. The 13 colonies became 13 states. Every state got 2 senators, and then a number of members of Congress according to the number of people they have. So that's how we need to count them. That's the basic reason why. When the census was started, not everybody was counted equally. African-American slaves were 60% of a human being, the 3/5 compromise. Native Americans were not counted at all. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment came in and subsequent changes to the Constitution with other amendments that today, the census, by the Constitution, the Census Bureau is required to count every single person in this country. Not just citizens, not just men, not just voters, not just adults, not just straight people, every single person. And the purpose of it is to allocate a portion of the House of Representatives, protection of civil rights. We need data on racial and ethnic groups to show where there is disparate impact in practices, so that's how we enforce civil rights laws. Billions of dollars get distributed using the data from the Census Bureau to states and localities, and then policymakers need good data to make good decisions. Just to give you a sense of how political power has shifted in this country, this is what the United States looked like after the 1950 census. You see that New York still was the big kahuna with 43 members of Congress. California's catching up with 30, 22 members of Congress for Texas, and Florida only has 8. After the 2010 census, you see New York and Florida are now equal with 27 members of Congress. California has the lion's share, or the largest share, with 53 members of Congress. Number 2 is Texas with 38. The red states are the states that lost congressional representation to the blue states. And if you see, there's only one red state, not in the Northeast or Midwest, that lost a congressional seat after 2010, and that was Louisiana. You all know why, right? Hurricane Katrina, massive demographic displacement. People left Louisiana, many of them moved to Texas, and in fact, what happened is that in that movement of people, there was a movement of congressional representation as well. This gives you a sense, you probably can't read it, of the programs that use census data to allocate federal funds: Medicaid, SNAP, highway planning and construction, Section 8 housing vouchers, state children's health insurance program, Head Start, Early Start, housing. Everything the federal government does, it uses these data. So if people are not counted, the communities where they live will get that much less political representation and the resources they need. And the irony is, when it comes to the resources, typically these programs are for vulnerable populations, right? It's for Head Starts, for children. It's Medicaid, for people who need health care. And these are the very same people the Census Bureau does a poor job of counting. In fact, in 2010, Dr. William O'Hare, who works with the Annie Casey Foundation, discovered that there were 1 million very young children missing from the 2010 census. These are children ages 0 to 4. And he called me up because he thought I would be interested in knowing that of those 1 million children, 40% of them were Hispanic children. And so we thought the 2010 census was going to be the one to finally get to the issue of how do we count all our babies? Because they can't count themselves. And when you think about it, if they're 0 to 4, then the children we're going to miss in 2020 started being born 2 years ago. And so we have work to do. So the 2020 census is going to be radically different from any census that any of us have had in our lifetimes, because the Bureau has been using a mail-out, mail-back method. It's very expensive. It hires people to go knock on doors if you don't return your census forms, which is very labor-intensive. In fact, it is the largest civilian mobilization the federal government does is to carry out the census. Congress told the Census Bureau that you will conduct the 2020 census without spending a penny more that you spent in 2010 in $2010. And so that required the Census Bureau to shave off $5 billion of what it would cost to do 2020 the way it did 2010. So they have been planning a very different census, using the internet for the first time. They're going to mail us all a postcard saying, go to census.gov / I forget what it is actually, and then fill out your census forms and hit submit. And trust us, nothing's going to happen. Russians aren't going to get your data. They're going to use administrative records because people complain, why is the Census Bureau so nosy? The feds know all about me already, and in fact, they do. And so the Census Bureau says, you're right. We can actually go to other data sources and get the information about you from IRS, from Medicaid, from the Department of State. And so they're planning to use administrative records to quite literally fill in the blanks if you return your census form incomplete or not at all. And they're going to reduce the workforce and just try to save money. But the biggest message I want you all to take away from today is that the operation the Census Bureau will now carry out in 2 years is not the census that the Census Bureau has been planning for the past 10 years. Because over the past few months, the new administration has required the Census Bureau to make fundamental changes to the questionnaire and to the operation that it is now required to carry out. And the Census Bureau is scrambling to figure out in these last few months before 2020 how it's going to pull it off in time for then. So first big problem was years of underfunding by Congress to help the Census Bureau ramp up and do all the testing it needs to make sure it's going to work. You remember health.gov? Remember what a disaster that was? But that was only reaching a slice of the population. This is census.gov. This is counting 100% of all of us, hopefully. How is it going to work? The Bureau has needed resources to make sure it has the technology in place for this. Rural communities are going to get hit real hard by the lack of funding. The Bureau had been planning an operation called Update Enumerate, where it sends enumerators out into rural communities, check addresses, and enumerate the family there on the spot. Instead, to save money, the Bureau will do Update Leave, where they will send out the enumerators, update the address, and leave behind a census form. And cross your fingers, hopefully that family will fill it out and return it. There is a dress rehearsal going on right now in Providence County, Rhode Island. The final test before 2020. And even that dress rehearsal, a dress rehearsal is a full reenactment of the real thing, right? Well, the Census Bureau isn't even able to do that right now. There is no communications program. There is no partnership program. Even the questionnaire that is being used in the final test is not the questionnaire that will be used in 2020 because the administration has required changes that came so late they weren't in time for the dress rehearsal or the end-to-end test. And then fundamentally, I'm sure you all have heard, there's been the addition of the citizenship question, and we'll get into that. The Census Bureau's finances have improved. Congress has finally woken up and realized they have the responsibility to fund the Census Bureau. And so FY18, FY19 is looking better for the Bureau, but they're still far behind in their planning. The end-to-end test that I mentioned that's happening in Rhode Island has been affected by these budget cuts. This is what I mean by the questionnaire that's in the field right now not being the one that's being used. You can't read this, but I'll do it for you. In the Hispanic origin question, there's an instruction that says mark one or more boxes to the question, are you Hispanic, yes or no? If you're no, you go to the next question. If it's yes, you have the option of marking yes, Mexican, yes, Puerto Rican, yes, Cuban, or yes, other Hispanic, and then you have to write that in. Dominican, Guatemalan, Nicaraguan, whatever you are. And the Bureau had been planning to allow those of us, not me, both my parents are Mexican, but had I had a Mexican and a Salvadorian, two parents, a Mexican father, Salvadorian mother, I could have marked both Mexican and written in Salvadorian. But if you look at what the Bureau is actually going to use in 2020, the instructions are gone because the Bureau has been told by the OMB since they went into the field with the top question that no, you cannot allow Latinos of multiple national origins to report those multiple origins. So if you're both Mexican and Salvadoran, we're going to have to decide who do you love more, your mother or your father. So we're doing our own test about what's happening in Rhode Island. We're going to do our own survey of a representative sample of residents to figure out what happened in Rhode Island so that we can use independently gathered information to apply to our own get out the count effort in 2020. Instead of a two-part question, are you Hispanic, yes or no, and then the next question being race, the Bureau had been planning to do a combined question where it would allow us to self-identify whatever we are and check off as many boxes. Years of research proved that this was a more effective way of getting the American public to self-report their race and ethnicity. The Census Bureau was stopped in its tracks by OMB that decided not to update the standards on how the federal government collects race and ethnic data, which was needed, an update, in order to use the combined question without any explanation as to why. So the Bureau now has to use this two-part question that I referred to earlier. Are you Hispanic, yes or no? And if it's no, you go to the next question after you answer Hispanic. The next question is, what is this person's race? And the options are white, black, American Indian or Alaskan Native. There are a number of Asian countries you can check off. And then there's the all catch-all, some other race. The problem with this question format for Latinos in particular is that once we check off that box that, yes, I'm Mexican, and then the Bureau asks me, what is my race? Half of Latinos says, what are you talking about? I just told you my race. I told you I'm Mexican. And the Bureau says, no, that's your ethnicity. Now tell me your race. And so Latinos are then forced to pick one of these categories. They don't find themselves, so they check some other race. And what happens? OMB says there's no such thing as some other race. These are the official racial categories in the United States. White, black, American Indian, Native, Alaskan, one of these Asian countries. So if you mark some other race, which many of us do, and then we put things like Aztec and, Chicano and Raza, the Census Bureau has to go back and using algorithms, assign us a racial category that is OMB approved. Census Bureau wants to get out of that business. It can't. It's going to this two-question format. It's imprecise in the collection of these data. But the biggest threat today now is the addition of a citizenship question. Are you a citizen, yes or no? Now, people think, well, it makes sense for any country to know if it's how many of its residents are citizens of that country. Yes, absolutely, which is why the Census Bureau already asks that question on the American Community Survey. It's a sample survey of 3.5 million households. It surveys every single year and releases 3-year and 5-year estimates. And the Census Bureau has determined, the researchers, that on questions like this, citizenship, that can be pretty volatile in some contexts, especially like today, that when you do it in survey format, you actually get better, more accurate data. But the Secretary of Commerce has required the Census Bureau to add this question. He did so, his order came down on March 26. Interesting. He issued a memorandum saying that the reason this question is being added is because the Department of Justice sent him a letter on December 12th saying that they needed citizenship data of 100% of the population, not survey data, in order to enforce the Voting Rights Act. Survey data on citizenship has been collected since 1950. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. So for the life of the Voting Rights Act, sample data on citizenship has been used to enforce the law. And never has a civil rights litigator, voting rights litigator, or the Department of Justice before said, those data aren't good enough, we need it from 100% of the population. But so for some reason, now the Sessions Justice Department says they need more citizenship data to enforce Voting Rights Act. And then last week, Wilbur Ross, Secretary Ross, sent an addendum to his memo saying, oh, actually, it was me who was thinking of adding the citizenship question all along. this is Wilbur Ross's memo, saying that he came up with the idea in February of 2017, and it was his idea to ask the Department of Justice if they needed this data for any reason. So if they did, could they please ask him to add the question? If you ask me, this is all Census Gate, what's going on. But there's a problem. There's a difference between having a citizenship question, are you a citizen, yes or no, if it's in the American Community Survey. It's a questionnaire of 50 questions versus the census, which is a survey of 9 questions. And in this environment, what do you think people are going to do? We're holding focus groups right now of immigrants to try to understand how we can encourage them to fill out their census forms. And in those focus groups, when we get to this topic, they're like, yeah, right. You think I'm going to fill out this census questionnaire? You think I'm going to tell the Trump administration if the people in my family are citizens or not? That's what's the dialogue that's happening across the country right now. But the Census Bureau still has the obligation to count everybody regardless. So this is going to drive up costs, because if people don't return their census form because they're scared, the Bureau still has to hire those enumerators and go knock on those doors. And remember, right now with the immigrant community, you have community groups telling immigrant families, if somebody knocks on your door, ask for a warrant, don't open, slip them this piece of paper that says that you want to talk to your attorney first, don't open that door. But then comes 2020, we have to tell these people, oh, but if it's a census enumerator knocking on your door, open it wide and tell them everything about your family. And that's what we have to do. And that's the challenge this country is going to have in order to get a full count, which is why there's so much opposition to this, including Penny Pritzker, Democratic Secretary of Commerce appointed by Obama, and Carlos Gutierrez, Republican Secretary of Commerce appointed by George W. Bush. Both opposed this, and the 6 past living Census Bureau directors all have expressed opposition to this, as well as the entire scientific community. That this is just bad policy. To add a question at the last, any question at the last minute is a problem, and in particular this question. And there are other pressing issues going on with this census right now. There's no permanent director. There's an acting director only, so there's this sense of ambiguity as to what's going to happen. GAO declared the 2020 census a high-risk federal activity way early in the decennial cycle than ever before because of all the moving pieces with the online process and everything else that's going on. And then now you add the new changes, it's even a greater risk. There's an erosion of public trust in contact with government, not just by immigrants who are afraid, but anybody. And then we all know the security of cyber data, right? And we have to, the Census Bureau has to explain to the public that filling out their census forms online is going to be safe. And remember, the Russians aren't going to get your census data. And there are at least 8 lawsuits that are pending right now. 6 challenging the addition of the citizenship question, a separate lawsuit by the NAACP challenging the overall design of the census, saying that it's designed to undercount African Americans, and then the state of Alabama is suing because they want immigrants completely excluded from the census count. So the 2020 census is in trouble, but there is so much at stake that we have to double down and do all we can to ensure that everybody gets counted in 2020. History is watching. There are no do-overs. After 2020, we will have to live with those numbers for 10 years until the next census in 2030. And we will have to depend on these numbers, flawed or not, on the reapportionment of the House of Representatives and the distribution of billions and billions and billions of dollars for a decade. We all need to work on an accurate census. David?
That was really eye-opening. So actually, let me just go back to understand this. Let me go back to the old version of undercounting, and then we'll come forward to the worries that we have. So can you help us explain in the old censuses, 2010, why did undercounting happen then? Just sort of walk us through how are people missed?
For several reasons. One has to do with the actual way that the enumeration is done. It's an enumeration of households, not really of people, but of housing units. The Census Bureau comes up with a master address file. And then that's the address file where they mailed paper census forms. Not to P.O. boxes, but to actual addresses. Not everybody has an address, right? Not everybody has a legal address. There's the converted garages. There's the basement apartment. There is the apartment that was built with 4 housing units that's been subdivided into 8. And not everybody has an address. And then there's a homeless population. So structurally, that was one of the reasons why people were missed. And it's also the reason why people were counted more than once. If you have 2 houses, people live in Aspen, and then they have the regular house in, I don't know, California. And they get counted in both places. So they're overcounted. University students are notorious for being overcounted. They get counted by their parents, and they get counted in the dorm. So the actual process itself lends itself to undercounting and overcounting. And then you have the fact that in order to convince somebody to fill out a form to the government, you have to overcome lots of obstacles in terms of attitudes, fear, what are they going to do, and not just immigrants. What are they going to do with this information? Are they going to give it to the police? Are they going to give it to the landlord? I told my landlord, we're a family of 3, but we're actually a family of 8. I'm not going to put everybody on my form because the Census Bureau may tell my landlord and I'll get in trouble. There's all these attitudinal reasons why people are missed.
And so if they're not in the mail database, they still might get, in the past, have been counted by the door-to-door knockers, right?
If the Census Bureau is able to identify these housing units without an address.
Okay. And what's your sense of do you have a sense of kind of estimated sense of the undercount rate for the Latino population?
The Census Bureau tells us it was 1.5% in 2010. I think it was much higher because this separate analysis by Dr. O'Hare found 400,000 children, Latino children, missing from the 2010 census. And if that was just our children, that in itself is about 1.5% of our population.
And did the Census Bureau, what did it say about the undercount rate for whites, for African Americans, for Asian Americans?
So it's highest for Native Americans.
Highest for Native Americans.
Then African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. In fact, whites are overcounted.
Okay. And your sense, I assume, is that the particular 2020 issues, to come now to today, are going to affect Latinos much more than any other group because of the citizenship question.
It seems like Latinos are in the crosshairs for Census 2020 because of the dialogue that's happening in this country right now towards immigrants. And remember, not all Latinos are immigrants by any means. About 65, 70% of Latinos are U.S. born, but many of us have immigrants in our families. I was born in this country. My father was born in this country. He's now passed. My mother's an immigrant. She's a naturalized citizen. So, we have mixed status households. And adding a citizenship question may scare the entire household from filling out the census form if one of the household members is an immigrant or an undocumented immigrant.
And this effectively, it seems to me, transfers power from some kinds of states to other states, right? That states with large numbers of populations that are going to be undercounted are effectively losing out in congressional apportionment, in dollars, to states that have less.
And this is an example where undercounting Latinos is going to hurt red states and blue states. It's going to hurt Texas. It's going to hurt California. It's going to hurt New York. It's going to hurt Arizona. It's going to hurt Illinois. It's going to hurt Florida. Because the South is the region of the country that has experienced the fastest and largest increase of the immigrant population. Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, Arkansas. Those states stand to lose money over the next decade if not all their immigrants are counted.
So which states will it help? Which states will have their population essentially inflated? The Midwest?
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. Ohio, maybe Wisconsin, Nebraska. We'll see.
Can you walk us through, there are a couple of tricky issues that touch on this but are also different that I know in part have come before the Supreme Court in recent years. Can you just walk us through the issues of how members of the military are counted and how prisoners are counted? It strikes me that there are actually some hard calls. Some of these things strike me as relatively straightforward, even if the Census Bureau is not doing them right now. But it strikes me there are some hard calls. Like, do you count prisoners where they are currently incarcerated or where they were sentenced? Do you count members of the military where they signed up or where they're stationed? Can you just help us?
So the overall principle is to count every person in the United States once and only once and in the right place. You hear the Census Bureau say this, it's their mantra, of where they lived on April 1st. That's the overall residence rule. So the question is, what is this person's usual residence? So for the military, because they're temporarily not in the United States, they will be counted in the census. The administration just made the determination not in where they're from, but from where they got deployed. So it's going to help those military bases where they were deployed from. Those communities will benefit from the count of military living overseas versus where that soldier actually will go home to once he or she finished military service.
And in the past, it was the latter. It was
Correct.
where they would go home to. And so now if you have someone who signs up with the military in Denver, is deployed in, and I'm making all of this up, is deployed in
From North Carolina.
to North Carolina, and then goes and is serving in Germany, they count as in North Carolina.
Correct.
Okay.
I wonder who benefits.
Who does benefit?
Well, North Carolina.
Yeah, and overall, meaning that is what red states?
States with large military bases.
Okay.
And remember, this is not just political representation, but it's resources. The incarcerated population. There has been a great debate in this country about where people who are in jails and incarcerated, where should they be counted? Where the jail is, or where the community where they live or will live when they get released? Because having them counted where the jail is artificially inflates the population in that community and deprives the community of where that person is going to go back from the representation, the resources where they should go. The Census Bureau had been planning to actually reallocate prisoners to their last known residence. They were not allowed to do that. So prisoners will now be counted in the place where they are incarcerated. However, if a state wants to reallocate its incarcerated population for redistricting, then the state will be allowed to do that. The Census Bureau is going to provide the states a tool to reallocate incarcerated populations internally within the state. But on a federal level, incarcerated individuals will be counted where they are incarcerated.
And on a state level, it'll vary. Some states will choose to do so and some won't.
Correct.
One quick aside, your mention of April 1st reminded me, if any of you have not taken the time to look up your own family's records with some of the online census databases, I really encourage you to do so because it's an amazing experience. My grandfather arrived here from Europe on February 26th, 1940, a Jew escaping. And I recently found him in the April 1st, 1940 New York City census, 4 weeks after he arrived in this country.
Fantastic.
And to see the handwritten notes of the census taker and to know the person who wrote that down stood there and talked with my grandfather, whom I never met. It's just an amazing experience. You can see who your grandparents or great-grandparents lived next to, and it really connects you in a personal way with a lot of this policy discussion that we're having.
There's a 72-year gap between when that census data can be released.
So we currently have 1940 and prior.
Right.
Right, yeah. Last thing before we open it up. So this is yet another area in which it feels like there is a large outcry from the academic community, from a bipartisan set of advocates, and it seems like the Trump administration is largely ignoring those voices. So what happens now? Does this just continue, that you have academic researchers and businesses and George W. Bush's and Barack Obama's commerce secretaries and all of the last 6 census directors say this is the wrong way to do it, and the Trump administration just says, yeah, but it's the way we're doing it? What happens now?
Well, there's 2 opportunities for there to be major changes yet again to go back to some of the original plans. The original questionnaire and the original strategies. One is if one of these lawsuits is successful and a ruling stands by one of these federal courts. 6 different lawsuits challenging the addition of the citizenship question. The first hearing will be held on July 3rd, and this is on the lawsuit brought by both the state of New York and 19 other states and the American Civil Liberties Union. Those two lawsuits have been combined into one to be heard by the same judge. The first hearing is July 3rd. And then there's 5 others and the other 2 that I mentioned. So the courts may force a change, or come November, if one or both of the houses of Congress flips, the new Congress may decide to force some changes itself.
How could a new Congress force changes? Meaning, wouldn't the president have to sign legislation?
It would, but it could do something like through the appropriations process. None of the funds in this appropriations bill shall be used for the printing of a census form that includes an untested question.
Okay.
It's what Congress could do, and which means not a questionnaire with a citizenship question because it's untested.
They could essentially stop things and force a negotiation.
Right.
Over it. Okay.
They could.
Let me open up to all of you. We've got some microphones. Welcome questions from folks. Tell us who you are and ask a question. In the back here.
My name's Odiaka Gonzalez.
Let me just wait 1 second. We've got a mic coming to you.
Sorry, thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Odiaka Gonzalez, and I do a lot of work with immigrant families and children. And I'm wondering, with this administration, I saw parents who are scared to go pick up their kids anymore. And what would be your advice on how to, since this is so important, how do we encourage them? How do we put faith in a system that has let them down? Yeah, so any advice there would be great.
Yeah, and I don't know the answers yet, and I don't know if I ever will, but we're trying. We have received some support from a number of foundations to do our own messaging research, to do focus groups, to do surveys, to try to find out what are the messages and messengers that can convince an immigrant family that it is safe and confidential to participate, nothing's going to happen, and in fact, our community will be worse off if you're not counted than if you participate. But how do you say that in a way that's believable? Some of the messages that we're testing are resistance messages. Things like, the people who want to deport you are the people who don't want to count you. So stand up and be counted, fight back. Can we say that? Will that resonate? I don't know. If you don't want anybody knocking on your door, fill out your census forms and you'll be done with it. If you don't fill out your census form, expect a knock on the door. Should we say that? And if so, how do we say it? Who should say it? So that's all the stuff that we're testing right now.
It's really interesting. Right here.
So when the GAO declared that the 2020 census was a high-risk political activity,
A high-risk federal activity.
federal
Not,
activity.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you said political. Okay,
No.
federal activity. Was that meant to trigger a certain set of policy responses or funding, and how has that been? Who has used that to what?
Let me just repeat the question. When the GAO declared the census a high-risk
federal activity.
federal activity, why? And
It
what
was
happened?
meant to wake up Congress. It was meant to tell the oversight committees and the appropriators, things are going south. You got to start paying attention. And Congress really didn't start doing that until last year. This GAO designation happened 2 years ago.
Hi, Darren Moran. Could somebody skip the citizenship question and still have their census count?
Ooh.
And if so, could one tactic be communicate to people who are uncomfortable to skip that question, but still fill out your census?
It's a very, very tricky situation. We just had the acting director at the NALEO National Conference on a panel to address these issues on Saturday. We had 1,000 of our members gather in Phoenix, and I asked him that question. I knew the answers, but I wanted him to say it. And his answers went something like this. People leave questions unanswered on these questionnaires all the time. We will make determinations at the field level when we need to send an enumerator out to get the answer to the question, or if we will go to an administrative record to get the answer, or if it's not worth it and we just will proceed without getting anything and just leaving it blank. So that was more or less his answer. I can say this, participation is required by law. If you don't fill out your census form, you can be fined $100. Okay, no one's ever been prosecuted. Well, not yet. If you answer falsely, you can be fined $500. So I have already heard people say, tell people to boycott this, boycott the question, or just tell everybody to answer yes. You're advocating for people to break the law. So we need to be very careful what we say and how we explain the situation. That's what the acting director said, by the way, on Saturday. If a new director appointed by this White House gets nominated and confirmed before the census, I don't know what that person's policy will be.
There's a real conflict between the first message you said, which is fill out your form and then be done with it, and someone won't be knocking on your door, and the idea of people not filling out that question. Because it seems like, although you can't know, there is a heightened risk of a follow-up if you don't answer that question.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Bureau will say, well, if millions and millions and millions of people leave that question blank, we just won't have the resources to go out and ask everybody. But I don't know exactly what administration will be in place at the Census Bureau come March 2020 when the process starts to confidently say what the policy will be.
Yeah. Can I ask you, yeah. Just wait 1 sec, we'll get one. Thank you.
Alejandra Castillo from YWCA USA and Arturo. I know that you know the technicalities, but in this world of where all the rules have been turned upside down, I know that the Secretary of Commerce kind of ran the clock and pushed this citizenship question at the tail end. And in his argument, he said that there was no opposition to the question from the outside world, the advisory council.
He said that there was no empirical data that showed that it would suppress response rates.
Correct, and I recall that the response to that was that was the job of the Commerce Department. So where are we on that front? Will the Commerce Department ever come back, and will the professionals of the Commerce Department ever come back and test that?
And this goes to the contradictions in the Secretary's memorandum ordering this question. He says that between December and March, after he got the request from the Department of Justice, and now we're finding out he's the one who asked the Department of Justice to make the request in the first place, Census Gate. What did he know and when did he know it? He says that he asked all these experts and no one, he said he called 24 individuals who were experts on the census to get their advice. I was one of the people he called. We spoke on March 13th. And I told him what I thought this question would do. In his memorandum, he said nobody, including me, gave him empirical data to show that adding the question will discourage anybody from filling out the census form. Well, it's not my job to test the Census Bureau's questions. We have an agency that does that. It's called the Census Bureau. But there was no testing of that. And then he goes on to say that in order for this question to be the least intrusive possible, I order this question to be listed last without citing any empirical data about the sequencing of the questions and making it last. The Bureau knows that the sequencing of questions actually results in different response rates. There's a reason why it asks gender before age. And it goes through their testing. So the Secretary of Commerce just arbitrarily says, add this question and add it last. And that's, in fact, the basis of many of the lawsuits challenging that logic.
What would be let me ask a quick question, but let's get a microphone here. What would be the right way that race ethnicity thing is a confusing issue that predates the Trump administration.
Absolutely.
Right? Imagine we made you the emperor of all things census, right?
Some people think I am.
And you get to design a form that you just think is going to be the most accurate. How would you design the form? Would you merge them into one question? What would you do? What should it be?
It took a lot of convincing for me to support the combined question, because it would have meant the elimination of a standalone Hispanic origin question in which everybody is asked, are you Hispanic, yes or no? And my predecessors, civil rights advocates from the 50s and 60s fought for that question. And for me to say it's okay to collapse that question with the race question We had to be convinced that it actually resulted in more complete, more accurate data about Latinos. And the research, years of research, showed that it did. So I would actually do that. The other thing that the combined question had was a new category called MENA, Middle Eastern North African. Advocates in that community for the past 30 years have been advocating for something that would allow people from whose origins are from that part of the world to indicate that they're Moroccan or Egyptian or Syrian or Lebanese or Arab, because right now the Bureau says if you're from one of those countries, you are white, and check the white box. And people are saying, my people just don't, the people from Egypt just don't identify as racially white,
Right.
and they don't find themselves on the form. But OMB, by not updating the standards, is not allowing the MENA category to go forward.
One question to me just strikes me as so much more simple and intuitive, right? But we can hope one day we'll get there, right, rather than two.
Hi, Leslie Poole, and I think my question really sort of is what reflects what you just said, is that although we continue to underrepresent African Americans, Blacks on the census, with the census, what's been the learning, like post-1870? Like what have we learned, and how long did it take to sort of get a fair representation of African Americans on the census? Like, when was that?
Well, the undercount of African American men really didn't come to light, and I think it was until World War II, when more African American men joined the military than were counted in the census. And that's how the Census Bureau found out, oh, we're missing a lot of people here. And it wasn't until mid-century, 1950s, 40s, 50s, that the Census Bureau actually started paying attention to the fact that it does a poor job of counting African Americans.
I think there's another one here. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for the conversation. Just a clarifying question on some of the language used today. When you are using the term immigrant, are we referring to folks of permanent residency? And when we're talking about citizenship, are naturalized citizens considered immigrants?
Yes. If you are foreign-born, you're an immigrant. And you are foreign-born in this country, you can have any different status. You could be a naturalized citizen. You can be a legal permanent resident. You could be a DACA applicant. You could be somebody under temporary protected status. You could be somebody here who has refugee status or asylee status. And, even immigration courts spend days sometimes trying to figure out what the correct designation should be for an immigrant, given all these, variations. But when I say immigrant, I mean foreign-born.
I want to end with one broader question, which is it encompasses many of this, but it also goes broader. So have you thought at all about what kind of messaging and language might persuade people who have not yet been persuaded that the tenor of the conversation and policies toward immigrants and immigrant families in this country has gotten off track?
Yeah.
It strikes me as remarkable and frankly worrisome that the entire controversy at the border does not appear to have had any effect on the president's approval numbers. It is clear that President Trump and people around him view these kind of immigration crackdowns as politically beneficial for them. They want to be running a midterm campaign and presumably later a re-election campaign on these issues. They like this. This is where they want the conversation. And so clearly there are many people who have already been persuaded that this is problematic, right? Have you thought about what kind of language and messaging, and I say this with a deep sense of humility, I don't know the answer to this question, might win over more people that the direction we're headed in terms of how we're treating immigrants today is the wrong direction? Yeah. Well, we're trying. And it's part of our messaging research that we're doing, the surveys, the focus groups. Some of the foundations are actually interested in surveying the non-immigrant population to try to, on the question of the census, to try to get broader support for a fair and accurate census so that everybody understands that if any group of people in this country are missed out on the census, it hurts us all. And try to figure out how do we message that so that there's more support in general for a fair and accurate census. Do you think that the attitude, do you think President Trump has activated a nativist sentiment, an anti-immigrant sentiment, and racist sentiment that can now not be put back in the box? And do you think we are going to live in a more race-based society over the next decade or so than we have, even more so than we have experienced? Or do you think there is a chance that we will look back on this period ultimately as a period?
My hope is young people, younger generations are growing up and they have a very different view of race and very different view of diversity, very different view of sexual orientation. And my hope is that as those generations mature, hopefully this kind of nativist, racist sentiment that has been given, license to be expressed openly will fade out as new generations take over.
And I think one of the other things is that I think there are many people who hold very conflicting views, right? I mean, what's the song from, is it from Rent? All of us are a little bit racist, right? And I think that you can imagine we are now in a period where these, to me, very odious views are given permission to be aired. It isn't that hard to imagine a tipping, right? Where we could go to a situation where, in fact, they, again, are much less acceptable than they were. And one small thing that strikes me as fascinating is there are a substantial number of Americans who voted for both Donald Trump and Barack Obama, right? And it would be a mistake to think that their views are simple on these matters and might not flip back to have a different view toward race again.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.